Many of you have endeavored in the action of doing a DIY. Anybody try to DIY? Some of you don't even know what that acronym means. Do it yourself. It's just when you actually you go get materials. Maybe you go to YouTube and you get the secret sauce, which is a 3-step tutorial on how to do what you thought you could do, only to later find out that you couldn't do what you thought you could do. Anybody been there? You go get the materials. Yeah, I've been there many times, especially with our cars. You buy the materials, you put them together, and you admire your masterpiece. At least that's your hope, right? You're like, oh, it's going to be good. Your wife tells you don't do it. You're like, hey, listen, woman, I can do this. I've been made to achieve. I've been made for greatness. And she's looking at you like, wait a minute. Who is this man? You have YouTube, and all of a sudden you think you're like this master mechanic, master construction guy. But anyway, you still continue to do it. A guy once decided to build his backyard deck. Some of you guys can really relate to that. So he goes at it. He has no experience, no plan, just what all of us have. Just good old confidence in Google and YouTube. He gets hard at work. He gets his materials. He buys the wood, starts drilling. And after hours of work, he finally looks at his masterpiece, and he's a little bit frustrated. He's trying to admire it, but he notices that it's actually tilting. It's actually quite bent. It's not looking so good. His wife comes out and says, so what is this? It's like, well, this is, what I created. And she's like, did you read the instructions? I was like, of course I did. At Google and YouTube. What else do you need? He's like, but do you see what you have? I said, yeah, I see exactly what I have, a masterpiece. Some of you have tried your own masterpieces. Tried it really hard, tried to do it your own way. You skipped a couple of steps. A couple of fine-tuned directions that would have been very helpful, only to realize that your masterpiece is not that master and it's not a very good piece. It's something, yeah. Maybe you rushed ahead thinking that you knew what you were doing when you knew exactly that the little voice inside of you, what it was saying was actually true, that you didn't know what you were doing. You ignored the warnings, every single one of them, because you, like just about anybody thought, warnings are just suggestions. So you went at it. And at the end of that process, there was just a lousy mess. And sometimes it's because we didn't listen to the right instructions that we have just a chaotic, messy experience. Whether you're trying to build a deck or trying to make a cake, if you didn't follow instructions, guess what? You're taking a big risk. You're taking a big risk. This morning, we're going to look at a passage of shipwreck in Acts chapter 27. I want you to go there. Just put your finger there. We're going to get there at some point. Just be mindful that we're getting there. It'll take me a little while to get there, though, because I want to kind of soften the sauce here before we get there. In Acts chapter 27, Paul is warning the sailors to not set sail. There's a ship involved in this. He tells the guys, let's not set sail. Of course, they ignored him, and they trusting that their own judgment was better than the judgment of God. They ended up in a massive storm that nearly wrecked everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. And the good news for them, as it is for us, is that even when we find ourselves in a messy situation, whether we caused it or we didn't cause it, it was caused by somebody else, God is always at work and is always trying to bring you through it. And I think this morning, that's what's going to be really important, that you remember the through it part. This morning, I want us to look at how to handle difficult circumstances, difficult situations, things that you thought would go just as planned, only to realize later that it wasn't at all what you planned. Every faith journey, every opportunity to grow spiritually in your faith involves several elements in there. We started this series several weeks ago, and I've been off and on in this series, either been sick or on a mission trip, but here I am again. And so we're going to try and pick this up again. We started off with a dream or a preferred future that God has given you for your relationship, for your opportunities, your job. Along the way, you have to make a decision. You have to take action in your vision and what God has laid in your heart. You have to do something. That is the nature of faith, is that it is active. You do something with your faith. It is not silent. It is not sleepy. It is not dead. And we talked about delay, and many of you resonated with the whole idea that delay is not denial. At least oftentimes it's not. And every good work that God starts, there's oftentimes a period of delay. And during that period, oftentimes we just need to be resilient and endure, because oftentimes ahead of delay is difficulty. The challenges will become your test before you see a breakthrough. Again, before we get to that passage, I want to just take you to the words of Jesus, because Jesus himself promised, and that's an important word there, he promised we'd face difficulty. And I think you have to realize that, just like I have to realize that there's a promise and difficulty, because if you don't realize that there will be challenges and difficulties in your life when they come and descend into your life, you will think that maybe you were at fault, maybe the saying is working, maybe other people are working, or maybe, just maybe, you are in the middle of sin that you're not even aware of. When Jesus promised difficulties, he promised this to everybody. And I'm going to take you there this morning to John chapter 16, verse 33, as you keep your other finger in Acts. And Jesus said, in this world, not in the next world, not in heaven, not where he dwells, in this world called your circumstances, your relationships, in this world where there is sickness, in this world where there is struggle and strife and challenges, in this world where things don't go out the way you would thought they would and aspire to go the way you thought they would. In this world, as long as you live in this world. If you take a ship to Mars, that's a different story, but Elon Musk is not there yet. So in this world, you will. Not you might, maybe, perhaps. We'll see. It's a 30% chance, like the weatherman says. No. Like Jesus says, you will have trouble. Guaranteed. It's not because he hates you. Oftentimes, it's not because he's upset at you. It's not because he's angry at you. It's because in this world, you will have trouble. As long as we live in a broken world with sinful people, us included, there will be trouble. But take heart, Jesus says. Hey, I know that this seems like bad news, and for those of you who are newcomers, you're thinking, boy, this is like really bad news. Listen, with every bad news, there's good news. In order for good news to be good news, there has to be bad news, and there's good news, and the good news is take heart. Why? Because Jesus says, I have overcome the world. I have overcome the world. What has Jesus overcome that we have not overcome yet? It's death. Jesus has overcome death. The enemy of all enemies, the one you and I can't escape, lest Jesus come now before we die, but otherwise you and I will die. And Jesus saying, I conquered the world, I conquered death, I overcame, and because he has overcome, we can draw courage and encouragement from God. But we got to be honest, problems are a part of life. And you're either just coming out of a tough time, some of you are there. You're just coming out of a tough time. You've had it rough. You are here this morning by God's grace. You're like, I've spent hardship upon hardship. Now you're kind of resting and you're glad. For some of you, you're in the middle of it right now. You walked in knowing that you're in the thick of it. And some of you, you're about to go through one of them. I find myself in that category where I'm like, hey, life is good right now. And I'm thinking, okay, Jesus says you will have trouble. I'm like, all right, it's coming, it'll come. Even the Apostle Paul faced big challenges. But Paul never gave up on God's calling for his life. Let me take you to another example, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 4. Paul talking, he says, in almost everything. No, he says, in everything. Work, relationship, life in general, parenting, taking care of your parents. In everything we do, we show that we are true ministers of God. The overflow of our relationship with God is this showing that in everything, every walk of life, every path that we take, we are servants of God. We serve God. We patiently endure. And then here's the list. 3 things. And just as you think it's like it can't get any worse, the list gets worse. We patiently endure what? Troubles and hardships and calamities. Like, oh my gosh. And not just that, of every kind. And of every kind. We patiently endure, showing that we are actually different. We're followers of Jesus, and we're demonstrating that we're ministers of God. And in Paul's life, I believe, and as many people do, that it was a show of testimony, of endurance, a story of endurance through difficulties. And if he had a secret, the secret really is a person. That person is Jesus. But here's 3 keys in dealing with difficulty that we can see from his life, from the very passage that we'll be exploring with this morning, Acts 27. And the first point is going to be this. This is a key amidst your difficulties that you're in the middle of, or you will come across, or you have already left, and that is determine the reason. Why is this happening? Why me? Why this? Why now? Right? That's the way it typically goes. What caused the difficulties? I just want to share with you, it usually comes from from 4 sources. And if not one of the 4 sources, it comes from every one of those angles. Here's the first one where difficulties tend to come from: ourselves. Myself, yourself. We oftentimes make these really bad choices and mistakes. You know, as a matter of fact, if I were to say who can relate to that, I bet you most of you would be like, yeah, me. We've all traveled that road where we just missed the boat. It was us that brought it upon ourselves. Sometimes it takes months, if not years, to finally realize that we were the problem. We were the common factor. And sometimes difficulties, challenges come because of our own choices. And other times, it's not because of you. It's not because you did something wrong. It's not because you made a mistake. It's because other people, their actions affected you. It impacted you. You know, we're seeing it right now nationally, aren't we? You know, with the government out of control, we're finally kind of bringing in the expenses. And somebody else's mess. Now, people are getting laid off, and it's nothing personal towards anybody, but it's the fact that it's other people's mistakes have finally landed in our generation. Again, it might be to no fault of their own, right? Sometimes we are caught in that, aren't we? When a spouse cheats, violates trust, is dishonest, it is something that you were unaware of, and then it comes descending upon you, and you're like, I didn't have anything to do with this. Which is very rare, actually, for us to say we didn't have anything to do with it. But sometimes it's the actions of others that impact us. And I believe those are the hardest to really deal with. I really do think those are really, really difficult, because all along you're thinking, I didn't even cause this. And then there's Satan. There's Satan. Spiritual attacks to derail God's plan in your life. But many people, and I think many people here, as well as just in Christian circles, we tend to blame Satan way too much. We blame him way too much. We're like, well, it was Satan who made me do it, who made her do it. It is Satan that's working in my life. Listen, Susie, Ethel, Bethel, Billy Bob, Joe, Sam. I just want to talk to you this morning. Stop blaming Satan. Because odds are is that you don't even know when Satan is working in your life, just like Job. And rather than blaming Satan, what is your circle of blame? What is your part in the issue? Oftentimes, we like to blame him so that we can escape responsibility. Man, think about it. When was the last time you're like, man, Satan's really working? And if you stop long enough, you'll be like, no, listen, Bubba, you were the one really working. It happened because you made that mistake, that error. Whether it was sinful or not, sometimes it doesn't even matter. But let's stop blaming Satan way too much. Let's be boasting. Oh, yeah, I'm getting all the credit, because that's what he does. He takes all the credit. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed Satan, and Satan took all the credit. Sometimes that's what we do. We give him all the credit. Ever heard the preacher that in a funeral, he's like, oh, Satan is charging against Satan? It's like, God is still in control last time I checked. He's still in control. He's still the sovereign king of the universe. There's nothing that happens outside of his knowledge, which leads us to our fourth, which is it happens because of God. You see, God either allows or causes certain challenges in our life. Now, we don't like that. We really don't like that. We like to give God a pass because we feel like we need to protect God. Like, no, God was not aware of this evil. He was not, for some reason, he didn't see this one. Is everything that's happening in my life, God is unaware, but the reality is that God is always aware. Even the bad stuff that happens in our lives, it went through his desk first. He saw it first. And somehow, he allowed it. It doesn't mean that he caused it. It doesn't mean he's done evil to you. It's not the nature of who God is. But God not only know about it, he allowed it. And we have to trust in his wisdom that maybe perhaps he allowed it for your benefit and for his glory. And now sometimes it's all four things going on at the same time. For example, Job, perfect example. It was himself, his other people, it was saying it was God. And the himself part didn't happen until afterwards, until everything, the mess was done. So how do I know? How do you know where it's coming from? If it's, one of four areas where challenges come from, how do we begin the process of, who's at fault? Well, James chapter 1, verse 5, I think is very instructive. I know some of you are still like, hey, aren't we in Acts? I know. I'm priming it. It's going to be like a bow at the end. You're going to like this. James chapter 1, verse 5, go there. If any of you, how many of you? Any. Oh, but I've said, no, if any of you lacks wisdom. Ever lack the wisdom to make the choice? You're like, oh, I don't know what to do here. What should I do that? Should I tell? Should I not tell? Should I take? Should I not take? Should I go this direction or that direction? Every one of you who walked in here, you have decisions to make. You need wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should do what? Ask God. Man, how many times are we like, I don't know what to do? We go to our friends, man, I don't know what to do. We go to, Google, because Google knows quite a bit. Like maybe Google knows how to, what's going on. Maybe in YouTube, maybe ChatGPT, AI, maybe that can help me. And James is saying, no. Like, listen, if any of you lacks wisdom, this is your answer. You should ask God. Why? Because he gives generously to all without finding fault. In other words, he doesn't hold back. He doesn't discriminate. In other words, he doesn't care what you've gone through. He doesn't care whether you messed it up or not. He doesn't care, whether you even know Jesus or not. He's saying he finds no fault to not give an answer. You should ask God. And what is the it here? His will, his wisdom. And his wisdom will be given to you. Notice, it's a promise. It's a given. It's not like, you really were bad this weekend. He really did see that. I don't know if he's going to answer. You didn't really in the face of Facebook, you're lucky it didn't show up there. Maybe show on Instagram or Snapchat. But Facebook, where all us old people were at, it didn't show up there. No. Like, wait a minute. Like, no. It will. He will give it to you. He will give to you because everybody who asks will receive wisdom. So what do you do when you have a challenge? Ask for wisdom. Prayer brings insight. Worship brings even insight. Ever coming here to church and you were confused, you were overwhelmed, and during the worship or during the message, God gave you exactly what you needed for this moment? That's why I need to be connected to God's presence. I've heard it for many of you after a service, you're like, Usually, it's one of you comes, oh, man, I can't believe, did you hit right? You hit me right where I was at. It's almost like you were, like, no, like you were in my room. And then I get all creepy. Well, maybe I was, in your room. And then that sounds weird. We look at each other weird, like, I forgot I said that, right? And then I'll make it even more weird. I'll say something like, oh, I read your journal. And we're like, ha, 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 the awkward ha, ha, ha. And we're like, okay, I need to move on. But the idea when I bring it up to you is that, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's a thing, got the Holy Spirit, a person, that he knew your needs before you walked in, and he knew this message would be the message for you. Unbeknownst to here, Dodo had, I just prepared it because he let me to prepare it, not necessarily with you in mind, and then you're the one who's like, man, praise Jesus. Ever walk in here and feel that way? Most of you. I even, after preaching or during the preaching, I'm like, whoa, this is for me. And I'm the one who prepared it. So what is Paul's situation? Here we go, we're landing the plane. Paul was a prisoner being transported to Rome by ship. This is the latter days of his life. Luke is making an account here in the book of Acts. God warned him to tell the sailors to wait until winter to start moving. They ignored the warning and set sail anyway. They rushed ahead and they sailed right into a storm. And that's the background. Go to verse 9. Go to verse 9. Acts chapter 27, verse 9. Much of the time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. It's interesting to me how impatience almost always leads to trouble. Rushing into a marriage, into a job, into a move, into a breakup without God's guidance almost certainly leads to some type of trouble at some point. You're headed towards the storm, don't even know it. Because, there's 3 common mistakes that lead to trouble, and the first one is this: listening to bad advice. Ever been there? Remember those days when you were younger, and maybe you're the younger right now? You're like, oh, that's me. All my friends, they don't even know what they're talking about. But you listen to them, listening to bad advice. Notice in verse 11, it says, but the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, so there's the key word, instead. Oh, instead. But the centurion, instead. How many insteads have we ever had? You remember your instead of? You remember your instead? Instead, listen to what Paul was saying. The centurion followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Listen, folks, just because somebody is an expert, it doesn't mean that they're leading you to the right direction if God says otherwise. Some people keep on asking different people for advice, thinking that maybe they'll hear what they want to hear, all the while really listening to bad advice. And here, can you blame them? Like, the centurion is like, who do I listen to? Paul, he's not really a guy who is setting sail anywhere, or the owner of the ship and the sailor, the captain. From just natural observance and just stepping back for just a moment, guess what, folks? You and I would have listened to the same people. Bad advice. Sometimes mistakes happen because and leads us to trouble because we're following the crowd. Notice in verse 12, here's the following of the crowd. The majority, folks, the majority means the majority. The majority means that there were some people that weren't in the majority. The majority means that there is a minority, right? The majority decided that we should sail on. And just because everyone is doing it doesn't make it right. Truth isn't decided by popular vote. That's not the way truth is decided. And in this case, who is the crowd? How many are in the crowd? How many are in the majority? You know how many are in the majority? 273 dudes. You know how much is the minority? 3. Luke, who's writing the account, Paul, and a guy named Julius. They're the 3. They're like, hey, maybe we should consider listening to God. 273, like, nah, thanks for the advice. We'll move on. Or trusting circumstances over God's direction. Man, we're so good at this. Oh my goodness, we're experts at thinking that we can read the circumstances, right? We say things like, oh, if this happens, that means I'll go this direction. Oh, if I see this one thing, oh, that means that God is saying this other thing. And we tend to trust circumstances over God's direction. Notice in verse 13. When a gentle south wind, you have to read it that way. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Oh, all is well. Our circumstances say, baby, let's go. Things look good at first. A light breeze, seem like the perfect conditions. You know, folks, Satan can cause or create false opportunities to lead you into a mess. They thought it was the perfect conditions to move on. But God had already told them what? Don't do it. Don't go. Through Paul, he already said that. The most frustrating thing is when difficulties come into your life because of somebody else's mistakes. Paul was innocent, yet he suffered for the bad decisions of others. And this morning, you may be one or the other. It's funny, we look at Scripture, we always want to be the hero. We want to be Paul in the Scripture. I'm the Paul. I'm the 3. What if you're the sailor? What if you're the centurion, the guard in the story? What if you're actually the owner of the ship? Or the one charting the course? Or the sailor who's just sweeping the floor? That would be me. I'm just sweeping the floor. You see, we think to take the heroic view in a passage instead of like, what if God is speaking to me? Not because I'm like Paul, but because I'm like the other person. The one that didn't do anything. Inactivity is activity, by the way. Passivity is doing something. This is the second thing, what to do during difficulties, and that is determine the result. What can I learn from this? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, I love this. It says, for our light and momentary, pause here for just a moment, are what? To the scriptures. Our light, which means not that heavy, kind of light. And momentary meaning what? Temporary, it's momentary, right? It doesn't feel that way, does it? When you're in the middle of it, it doesn't feel light. It feels really heavy. And maybe you say words like, I don't have emotional margin for this. I don't have the margin to deal with this. It doesn't feel light. It doesn't feel like it's short-lived. But yet, for our light and momentary troubles, what are they doing? They're achieving. It's achieving. It's not achieved or will achieve. It's achieving right now for us eternal glory. It's not momentary glory. It's eternal. That's the comparison. Eternal glory that far outweighs. It's not light. It outweighs them all. It's beautiful the way he kind of puts that comparison in there. Say, hey, listen, it's momentary, it's short-lived, it's light what you're experiencing compared to what's to come. What's to come, it's eternal. It's not going to end, and it's heavy. What's so ironic is the word glory means heavy. So it's saying what's to come is heavy of heavies. It's really heavy. What's really heavy? The glory that's to come. The glory of God, the reward from God. No matter where difficulty comes from, God can use it for good, for your good and His glory. And you got to remember 2 things. Problems are temporary. They won't last forever. It feels like it's going to last forever, but it won't. You've been through this before. Don't forget, last time you went through difficulties and challenges, what happened? You came through it, right? When you depended on God. God's purposes also are permanent. They're permanent. God's purposes are permanent. The lesson is that you will grow. God is more concerned about your growth than He is anything else in your life. He is more concerned about growing you spiritually in maturity. Notice how Paul put it to the Romans in chapter 5, verse 3. It said we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. I love the fact that it says when we run into problems and trials, because sometimes we run into things not on purpose. Every December, Marisa and I try and, go to Colorado, see the snow, kind of rekindle the romance, and kind of get your minds out of the gutter, But it's our time. The kids aren't there. We don't have snow here. Come on, guys. Last time we had snow, it was mostly ice. And the little snowman we made, it was like the size of a fist, or made two fists together. And we boasted, and we put it in Facebook. We thought it was this ginormous, snowman. And people in Colorado and up north are like, what are you smoking? Like, what are you talking about? Well, we go to Colorado. That's what we do. Don't judge us for it. We go to Colorado to see the snow. And there's this one place that we go to that we rent. And this is the second year in a row that we've gone there. Wonderful place. This mini house, and real cheap parking. And we get there this last time. We got there late. And of course, I don't like the cold weather. I know some of you do, especially coming from the north. Cold weather, that's your gig. That's your thing. It's not mine. And so I try and get out of it as fast as I can. So we get to this place. We get the stuff down. And of course, it's cold. So I want to get in real quick. And so I start going like a fast pace. Marisa's already ahead of me. She's already inside the house. I go fast pace, and all of a sudden, bam, into a door window. It's like the window, like the door was like a window, and I just smashed into it. Like really smashed. So much smash. Somebody's like, is everything okay? Are you all right? I was like, of course, you want to be the man during that time. You're like, of course everything is right. Nothing happened over here. Kid you not, the next day, because it was cold, the next day when I looked at the door, it had the imprint of my nose. I just ran into it. It hurt. I didn't confess that at the time. I didn't even confess it for service. I was like, no, she's here, Marisa. I'm not even going to confess it. It hurt. It hurt a lot. Like a boo-boo, It was pretty bad. But I ran into the door. Here Paul's talking about you're running into problems and trials. You weren't expecting it. You were running the race, and boom. When that happens, which is going to happen, when you run into those things, problems and trials, rejoice, not because you have those, but because there's something good at the end of that rainbow. For we know that they help us develop endurance. That's why you rejoice. You may feel like, well, that's not much of rejoicing. Like I'm growing in my character. It's like, yeah, it is rejoicing because it's a heavy weight when you're in our eternal dwelling place. For we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. It's when you're in the middle, in the thick of it, of struggle and tension and difficulty, that you look and you're like, man, there is hope around the corner. And that hope is that there's a day. The day of salvation is the day that there's no more struggle. There's no more curse in the world. There's no more sin in the world. There's no more cancer in the world. There's no more ailments in the world. There's no more people that we love that die anymore. Every storm is a school. Every trial is a teacher. Every experience is an education, if you let it be. But here's the problem. Most of us are slow learners. We're just slow. I mean, if God is looking at us or me, he's like, that's my slow one. Give him the yellow bus, the little one. Some of us are just really slow. No disrespect if like one of your kids needs to use the yellow, like the short bus. Not anything wrong with that. But we keep on forgetting that God has taught us. We even forget to graduate from the school of hard knocks. We're still a freshman, and we've been there 5-6 years already. You're the guy in that school that they're like, man, boy, he's tall and he's got a huge beard. But he's not a middle schooler. I'm telling you, he doesn't look like one. And we're like that person oftentimes. So God allows us to face more difficulties so you can grow into your beard. Sorry, guys. I mean, for dudes, you're like, yeah, you're speaking my language. For some of you ladies, you're like, it's not my language. I'm not growing any beard anytime soon, right? My point is like he's growing you. He's growing you to maturity. And some people walked in here with serious difficulties this morning. And I want to tell you, don't give up, grow up. Don't give up, grow up. It's time to start growing up. Here's number 3, determine my response. Determine my response, or determine your response. How should I handle this? The way we handle difficulty is way more important than the difficulty itself. Let me say that again for those of you who are falling asleep. The way you handle difficulty is way more important than the difficulty itself. Here's 3 wrong responses to difficulty. The first one is drifting, the drifters. Verse 15 of the same chapter, it says, we gave way to it and we're driven along. Some people stop trying when things get tough. Stop trying. They let their circumstances control them. They say, what's the use? And they go with the flow. That's what happened to some people here. In verse 18, we see there's some discarding. Some people, the way they react is by discarding. In verse 18, it says, they began to throw the cargo overboard. The storm is here. We're throwing the cargo overboard. The cargo, who is that? That's your relationships. That's your job. That's church. Man, boy, church is a big one. We just throw the cargo away. We're too busy now. It's too difficult now. Throw the cargo away. When times get tough, we're tempted to abandon the things that once were important to us, our dreams, our relationships, our commitments. But God says stay with the ship in verses 31 to 32. Or the one that we tend to have is despairing. In verse 20, it says, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. This person says, I just gave up entirely. After 14 days of storms, the sailor gave up. All the sailors, 370-something sailors, just gave up after 14 days. And the last thing they lost, guess what it was? Hope. And there's the right response to difficulties. And what is that response? If not, confess my part. Confess your part. What caused the problem to begin with? What is the percentage of that situation that is yours to own? What is the percentage? Some of you guys, you're so knee-deep in, you're like, my percentage is like 0.5, 0.05. And your spouse is looking at you like, listen, you're not 0.05. You're like more like 95, So my point is this, own your piece of the pie, your piece of the responsibility pie, and own it. Confess it before God. In Proverbs 28:13, it says, people who conceal their sins will not prosper, but if they confess and turn from them, they will receive mercy. Here's the second thing in how to react, and that is confront the problem. Confront the problem. Do what you can. Do what I can. Paul didn't just sit there. He took action. God didn't say, it'll be easy. He said, I'll be with you. Oh, we forget that. God didn't say it would be easy. He said, I'll be with you. Some of you need to claim a promise. In verse 25, it says, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. This is Paul telling the other sailors this. See, God didn't promise the ship would make it. He promised they would. He didn't promise the ship would make it. He promised that they would. And some of you need to hear that. Maybe you're feeling like your life is falling apart. Your difficulties seem to be delaying your dream. Don't give up. Don't be afraid. Don't drift. Don't discard. Don't despair or lose hope. It's interesting. Paul's confidence was in God, not in his circumstances. That's where his confidence was. Paul's confidence was in God, not in his circumstances. How many of you are putting all your little eggs into that one basket and you're like, man, I'm banking on this. Man, once you start saying I'm banking on this, you ain't banking on nothing. You only think you're banking on it. Don't trust too much in your circumstances. Trust more in the God who helps you go through your circumstances. No matter what's breaking apart in your life, God will get you through it. No matter what's going on in your life, God is going to get you through.